Welcome to today's session on governance in digital public infrastructure, opening government data for transparency and innovation. Just to frame today's session, in the digital age, effective governance of digital public infrastructure is crucial for enhancing transparency, fostering innovation, and enabling inclusive development. This session explores African perspectives on DPI governance, focusing on the strategies and challenges of opening up government data for public use. With me today, we have Pria Chetty from Genesis Analytics and Krisstina Rao from UCL. Pria and Krisstina will be our discussants in this fireside chat. Pria and Krisstina, would you briefly introduce yourselves to the audience? Let's start with you, Pria.
Thanks so much, Gavin, and thanks for the invitation to join this important but also very exciting topic. And I suppose with a slightly different lens to the DPI conversations, which focuses on data governance. I am Pria Chetty, currently joining from Johannesburg from Genesis Analytics. I'm a principal here in our Center of Digital Excellence, and I lead our policy and regulation.
Krisstina?
Thanks from me as well. Very pleased to be here. I'm Krisstina. I work with University College London's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which is very interested in how states, including the governments and the market, can work together towards problem solving for the future and in the present. One of those very essential topics around the future is digital public infrastructure. At IIPP, I lead the DPI map, which is a project focused on scanning what the state of DPI is in the world. And I do this work alongside Professor David Eves. Very pleased to be here.
Thanks, Krisstina and Pria. And thank you both for being here. In today's fireside chat, I think how we should run things is I will introduce 3 segments designed by you, and then have you discuss each of those segments. Hopefully during that, I can come up with some smart questions to pitch in every now and again, but at the very least, we will get to audience questions nearer the end. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay. Let's get into the first topic. So in this first segment, we're taking a bit of a global perspective. What are your experiences and observations in designing, implementing, and regulating DPI, specifically in diverse African contexts? I'll hand this over to you.
Thanks, Gavin. I'll kick off for us. Maybe just to start off with by saying that very early on in my career, I stumbled philosophically and conceptually on people who were speaking about information wanting to be free. And that, the more shareable it is and the more shared it is, the more its value grows. And we've seen that as we've seen permutations of, definitions from information to data. And I think that kind of thinking has really influenced the work that I do. And my most recent fascination has been with open government data legal frameworks. And here my interest was in trying to understand what some of the constraints might be to kind of what could be done with data for public good, what those constraints might be, and how might we tackle them and create a more enabling environment. And for me, I was looking for answers for countries like South Africa, who would be facing issues in terms of regulatory uncertainty, navigating legal issues around privacy and whether data can be shared, navigating issues of institutional mandates and who shares data and how open can we be when we speak about open government data as well. And a few interesting lessons for me at a very high level. The first is when I looked at all the models and frameworks for opening up government data, I found consistent references to data governance. And so it was highlighting the need to kind of crack that and solve that we need a better understanding of frameworks, protocols, processes that would be enabling for us as we pursued access to data, reuse of data, meaningful use of data in new ways, unprecedented ways. And the second is that if I looked at some of the regional frameworks that were coming out, especially directives and things that would inform countries and jurisdictions on how to approach this, we could see transitions. We could see, some early conceptions of public sector information then being conveyed as open government data. In African context, there were model laws that were speaking about proactive disclosures of government data. And then I took it a step further and I looked at some of the different countries, including Kenya and Rwanda, as well as countries in the global north, Australia, United Kingdom. And then I also looked at Brazil, which was very fascinating and really one to watch. But coming out of that, I could see a very strong parallel between what the ambition was from a technical perspective in terms of opening up data and enabling it for the uses we anticipate for innovation, for data-driven decision-making, and so on, and the kind of regulatory institutional frameworks that existed. And where there were interventions to try and ease some of those constraints, we found better data projects. So now we know that there's a tangible link. If we improve the data governance environment, we can have better data projects. And so I used that to sort of put together a framework, a kind of method of what would be the ideal for policy, legal, institutional levers that one could tackle to try and improve the success. And that's my intention for all of us, all the countries that are embarking on DPI projects, navigating issues around digital identity, the sensitivity of data that we might exchange in the digital payments layer as well, and then looking for that guidance in the data exchange framework. But what might be some of the ways in which we can answer those questions, and what might be an enabling framework? Now, I'm sitting with someone on this panel, Gavin, who's just introduced herself, who has just done a global DPI map, and as I understand, the first of its kind, and really just opening up the space to get a better understanding of what's happening in different countries. So, Krisstina, I'm really interested in what's come out of that process and what you've found, and especially your insights on the data governance elements. What for you were, I suppose, some of the complexities, some of the motivations, some of the successes that you saw coming out of the scan globally on the global DPI map?
Thank you, Priya. And thanks, Gavin, for allowing us to get to the meat of it right at the beginning so we can then dive deeper. So before I answer it more directly in terms of what came out of the DPI map, I think it's worth just framing where the DPI map came from and what it tried to do, which is not only, like Priya said, looking into the governance of DPI, because that's still a very complex topic that not everyone understands. They understand, but they don't fully put the pieces together the way there is emerging consensus about. So the DPI mapping project started with the intention to basically bring data to what folks were speculating about in the ecosystem anyway. We had some ideas. We knew that ID systems were being developed. They were being developed in an interoperable way. But what does interoperability truly look like? Are we only talking about data interoperability? Is it semantic interoperability? Is it a policy level mandate that interoperability needs to have, for example? What did the nuts and bolts of it look like? There is the 50 and 5 movement that was corresponding to this, which is the ecosystem was increasingly converging over the idea that over 5 years, about 50 governments should be adopting DPI in a direction that aligns with their own SDG goals and global SDG goals, which is very exciting. But how do we figure out who's progressing and in what direction and what's improving? So we basically took the concept of DPI to the drawing board, and we started charting out what its elements look like. There is technology, there is governance, there is adoption, Is it understood in the same way across regions? Turns out not. And can we find a one-size solution to it all? As Pria will, I think, go on to tell us, we think not. So there's diverse answers around the questions, and we try to add data points to it. So a few things we found. First, globally, when we talk about things like interoperability, we talk about policy mandates for interoperability, we talk about data exchange, keeping in mind data security, privacy, protection, things like that. These principles or these goals or these missions are achieved through very many different means across the world. In Europe, for example, a data exchange is now synonymous with X-Road, and seemingly across the world, when someone says, we want to build the data exchange element of DPI, they typically mean we want to build an X-Road, but it might not be a very realistic goal for some states operating with limited capacity or with capacity constraints. They might not be looking for such a sophisticated architecture around data exchange. They might be looking for something less sophisticated to meet their own either intra-government needs or government sharing data with the market kind of needs. So it kind of turned it on its head, right? We were not talking about the same thing when we said data exchange. In Africa, interestingly, the DPI map was able to work with a number of partners in the ecosystem to study the African landscape. So a word of caution is that the data you see on the map, which is at dpimap.org, relies on folks who we trust, who the ecosystem trusts to tell us what's going on ground. Our methodology focuses on desk-based resources and access to data. We found that Africa is telling a very unique story. It's saying that it doesn't need to rely on the same fundamental blocks that other countries may have taken 20 years to develop. They might start somewhere middle of the path and then build towards a certain use case. An example is governing institutions. Very many sophisticated DPI components are governed by an institution like a data governance body. But in Africa, as is true for Asia and also some parts of Latin America, these DPI may be governed by institutions like an ICT ministry or a data management authority, which perform the same functions, albeit in a more stretched manner, because it's one more function in addition to their existing responsibility. But this institutional mandate and this institutional governing body, the picture that forms accordingly around what laws can they regulate for, what kind of market regulations they can conduct, to what extent can they review the sharing of data, et cetera, changes a lot. Another example with data exchange systems is also that while most countries in the world rely on a data governance body, data exchange is happening through ICT ministries to data management systems. And this is more true for high-income countries rather than middle-income and low-income countries. So in middle-income and low-income countries, there is equal distribution of how data, the institutional agency that governs data sharing and management. But in high-income countries, it tends to be more often governed by a data governance body, which I think tells us a lot. It tells us that there is no one path to this. We don't need to take a goal from the West and place it on the rest of the world, because it might not be realistic, it might be very aspirational, and sometimes it might just not make sense for a certain country's context. So that's the beginning of it. And hopefully we get to dive into details further.
Thanks, Priya and Krisstina. We here in Africa do love hearing that there is an African perspective, a unique African perspective. So good to hear that there are intricacies that are coming from Africa. Building on this, what are the kind of constraints and challenges in Africa?
Yeah, Gavin, I agree entirely with Krisstina. I think what is really fascinating at the moment is the starter block for different African countries, and One, it might be in terms of constraints they face from resources, some institutional and so on. But I think also motivations, so we're seeing, DPI as a progression of something that might have existed before. And we're seeing it have these various proxies and being called different things. And so what's interesting is that in some countries, it's part of what is described as the data revolution or transitions economically. And so there's a huge dependency on DPI to support this economic transition, which is a deviation from the kind of, data-driven decision-making and, enabling innovation kind of rhetoric that we see. And so, as you say, Gavin, we should be embracing this, that we have different motivations and we're navigating different intricacies. So I suppose fast forward from some of the open government data work and to the current practical day-to-day work that I do now, I'm supporting some of the thinking around a Data for Change project in South Africa. That's looking at digital innovation in the public sector, but we have another proxy for DPI. But we are trying to navigate these issues of regulatory uncertainty and some of the issues around institutional mandates that might hold a country like South Africa with high ambition for digital innovation back from its true potential. And what we're working on is something that could match the technical architecture of DPI with a kind of legal governance architecture that would help enable countries like South Africa take this forward. And so we have done something called a regulatory universe for data-driven government. And we have looked at what could be enabling in the policy environment, commitments that were made that would support the kind of ambition that we have within this project. We have looked at within the legislation, what is constraining and enabling in legislation such as privacy legislation. I think that we always start off by thinking that copyright legislation and privacy is going to be constraining, but there are also provisions in there that really enable you to progress this, especially some of the provisions that allow for guidance and advisory from, your commissioner or data protection authority that can really support public sector organizations who are navigating this space. And then we also looked at what is interesting is that there's a range of public procurement that needs to happen to enable the DPI. And so, how does this happen? Who's responsible, which organization, and what would be the mechanisms to enable this? And then we progressed that into kind of more, a better view on the different institutions at play. And now we're looking at a methodology that can be applied to any kind of use case where there's either bilateral exchange of data or even multilateral exchange of data in various connotations, either government to government or government sharing with the private sector, and trying to take into consideration the range of actors in that. So all of the parties, any intermediaries, someone who might be involved in the security of it, and if you've got secure facilities that are handling the data. And what do you do at different points to try and build confidence and assurance that DPI can be done in a responsible way that accounts for the legislative parameters, the kind of institutional powers, and the rest. And so for South Africa, it's a very interesting case, high ambition, and complex environments to navigate. And so we're doing it in two ways, to try and navigate the environment, but also build a method that would produce a kind of sustainable approach as we get different use cases. Yeah, and Krisstina, you've worked in many countries, so it's also very interesting to hear your appraisal of how it's being done in different countries, and also some of the lessons, I suppose, coming out of those countries as well.
Thanks, Pria. I think when we speak of capacity and when we speak of constraints and challenges related to DPI implementation, only the constraints and challenges of developing economies really stand out because I think we try to place the goals of developing economies and align them with what developed or more mature economies have already achieved. But I think that placement itself is the problem, which is that the goals look very different. So with respect to the goals, what's really preventing these economies from reaching the goal? Now, the DPI map is a one-year project. So there's a lot of research questions we have that are not answered, which can remain questions, and we can keep throwing insights at them. But hopefully, eventually, we have more data to answer some of the questions about what prevents governments from moving further. But a very significant insight that we did have is that it may directly be related to state capacity. And it comes back to a rather rudimentary fact, which is that in mature economies, institutions are very well built. So problem solving around whose turf needs to solve for which issue, so on and so forth, is more streamlined and it's more straightforward. As developing economies are figuring out DPI, they are also navigating complex interdependencies between their own government agencies, which are figuring out how they can respond to the future as problems are arriving at their table. They try to adopt gold standards from more mature economies and more developed context, but they may not fit into their context. So in such instances, they need to be ahead of the curve because DPI is also about market competition and there's so many other geopolitical issues that they have to deal with. But they also need to problem solve for their own local context. So what they are doing is they're coming up with ingenious ways to solve for the constraints and challenges. One constraint around state capacity has almost been templatized, which is that they get a lot of support from aid agencies, from development banks, from consulting organizations, which are very helpful. But I think the singular defining characteristic around solving for it is to have their own mission and vision set up. So they know what they're collectivizing around. An example for this is what's very interesting in the background is the G20 chairmanship, which moved from India to Brazil to now South Africa. Each saw with every following year a more developed idea of DPI being formed. 2 years ago, DPI had not been defined, which changed with the New Delhi Declaration. Brazil is now managing to integrate DPI into their own mission statements in a very in a sense that really values its social outcomes. So related to health and equity, related to social inclusion, so on and so forth. And you see this in how they've developed PICs. It's been very participatory. It's been very hands-on. Civil society has been at the table. Market participants have been at the table. It's not the government just building such a system in its own silos. And now that's happening in South Africa. It's a very interesting context to witness from the outside about how South Africa is galvanizing around making sure government is at the table, markets is at the table, civil society is at the table, so that the vision and the mission that's formed around DPI is being formed keeping in mind everyone's perspective. And not only is that mission being formed and articulated, but every stakeholder's value in solving for that mission and addressing that mission is being simultaneously encouraged and developed. That means that DPI, in terms of its infrastructure capacity, in terms of the degree to which it invites stakeholders other than the government to build and use the infrastructure to the table, it's being actualized, which is a constraint and a challenge, I think, which is fundamental to DPI. But it's also, if you understand it well enough, you know how to problem solve and implement for it, and that's also true for the South African context.
Pria, anything to add there? We still have 3 minutes in the segment to go, or shall we move on to the next?
No, I'm nodding happily to the kind of applause for the South African approach, and I don't think we're alone. I think where African governments are, even if we're not speaking conceptually about DPI, but if we're progressing our conceptions of e-government to digital transformation strategies and so on. One, there's an acknowledgement that this can't be done in silos, and that this has to be a kind of multi-stakeholder effort. And at the same time, I think the consistent element is placing these social inclusion outcomes at the forefront, as you said, Krisstina, because there's a reality here to defend our time, to defend our resource, and to defend our inputs. We want to see how this plays out in terms of service delivery and the kind of pressing challenges, which are not the same in different countries. But what is consistent is placing those social inclusion and outcomes, and maybe also just realizing some of the constraints that we face as well. So happy to get the positive appraisal, and also for the continent a shout out to say that many encouraging developments, including in Nigeria and in other countries as well.
Great. I mean, that leads me on to how do we spread the news or share, right? So let's talk about developing community knowledge and maybe some equitable approaches to DPI governance.
Yeah. I mean, we probably cannot stress enough that this is a team effort. But a kind of cautionary that I keep in my mind is that this has to be something user-centric, because at the end of the day, when we expect this high level of engagement of citizens who need to use the resources that we're building, need to trust it, and need to be present in it, that's when really all our plans are put to the test. And so what's interesting, in this particular world of work, and I've been a technology lawyer for a long time, and I think there's been a less than democratic approach to how we roll out these large scale digital projects in previous years, and maybe we want to change that this time. And this time we want to stress that we're designing for the user in mind, and that would mean engaging the user. So, bringing the citizens to the party and trying to understand, what discourages use and what would be the kind of pressing incentives to get them to invest in this infrastructure as users. And at the same time, I think, what we're seeing in some of our countries is that we've got legacy challenges and some structural challenges that we face. And not just from access to electricity or the persisting digital divide that we see, and access to digital innovation, but we're also still seeing persistent low levels of digital literacy, now being translated as low levels of data literacy, meaning that we don't all conceive the benefits of why we should be sharing our data in order to enable an initiative like this. And how we can get benefits from that initial share of data as well. And so there's quite a bit to be done to build ourselves up to the point where we can see this mass consensus and uptake, and then we're going to see DPI really, really take shape. Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose, I'm interested, Krisstina, you've got a view between the developing economies and other countries, and you've seen how this plays out in different contexts. I want to press you now for a slightly different view, which is that given what's happening in the developing countries, what is it that potentially the global north could learn from us? Because I think we're already being characterized as an innovative bunch, and we're defining our own paths. We are consultative, we are including everyone, but we are innovating. And I want to ask you, what impresses you from your experiences engaging with developing economies?
Oh, I love that you left this question to the end, so we can leave more space for audience Q&A, because I don't have an answer. But to speculate, the cool thing about I'll bring it back to the DPI map, because I'm really proud of the work we've done as a team, but I also think it's told us a lot about what we don't know. So when you create a data project, it tells you a lot, and you get to dig into the details of what exists, but it lays down very evidently what you do not understand and what does not exist. So we have a lot of holes in our understanding of what works. The one approach in the developing economy context that's been really inspirational has been the problem solving for specific use cases and problem solving for scale. Typically, when a mature economy has built a DPI-like project, and we call it DPI-like because we want to harmonize this with the expectation that there may be different versions of DPI out there. So we're saying DPI-like. So whatever it is that developed economies treat as DPI, when they typically build these projects, they took a very institutional foresight view to it. And they said, we want to be able to achieve this in 10 years. We want our populations to be able to do this, access these services, so on and so forth. And now that this is reality for these economies and these contexts, when developing economies are looking at this, they're saying, okay, but what's pressing to us? We want to solve for the problem of vaccination delivery in this context. So we're going to solve for that and then hopefully scale up and then integrate it horizontally across different government agencies, bring in more people to the table, help problem solve at scale. And it's definitely more of a scale issue. I come from India, and the DPI story, the entire schlep of the DPI story is to solve problems for population at scale. And if not technology, then what? And in the absence of technology, it almost becomes impossible. So that is truly inspirational, because having that pressing urgency to solve for a problem sort of makes them more innovative and ingenious with respect to how they can bring in the right folks to the table to solve for the legal and regulatory issues for a very specific use case, whether it's in health, social welfare distribution, whatever it may be, and then make that a story that the other government agencies, especially in federal contexts, want to adopt and buy into. But I think the picture is still forming. Like I said, it's not one country's pathway that another country can form. And I think there are a lot of resources out there that now document the diversity. So my final shout out is to look at the DPI map, which is at dpimap.org. Not only does it document the state of DPI globally and gives you some broad ranged insights, some of which I highlighted here, but it also tells you which country might be closest to your context of legal and regulatory ecosystems, technology architectures, as well as adoption ecosystems. And then you have a realistic benchmark to work towards, rather than have a more global benchmark that might be truly aspirational and not realistic for your context. And then there's a lot of now consensus building around what the governance of it looks like. We realize that to make DPI really successful, you need to solve for what might be going wrong in the privacy of it, in the protection of individuals through it, in safeguarding the rights of individuals through the DPI development, use, adoption process. One initiative of significance is DPI Safeguards, that's led by the OSET and UNDP of the UN. And they have a toolkit which has about, I think, 260 or 300 interventions simply around the governance of DPI, which goes into everything from policies and processes to some legal frameworks that can be adopted and adapted to your context. And it goes into country case studies. So it tells you exactly not only what a country ended up adopting as a regulation, but also what the process of adopting that looked like, and what the process of participatory governance in it looked like, what were the problems faced, what are the challenges faced, so on and so forth. And this is incredible. It lays out very plainly that problem solving for governance is very sticky. And there are a lot of solutions that don't exist. But if there are solutions that some contexts have figured out, then there's a repository for it. And you can access not only the repo, but also the list of working group members and the experts that have helped develop it through this network. And then another small initiative that I wanted to point out is that a lot of organizations, including the Digital Frontiers Institute and UCL IIPP, are thinking about the governance question more largely. And there's now capacity building initiatives around DPI governance. So how do you take into account your very specific context of stakeholders? Who's important to solving a data privacy issue? Which of these is an ambassador for you? Which of these is someone who can support you in a journey? And who of these are potentially going to be a hurdle in you problem solving for that privacy issue? How do you bring them to the table? What are methods that work? What are methods that don't work? And then what are strategies that you can use along the way to make sure this is a successful project and development? And this happens in a very learning-based environment. So you're working alongside other leaders from government, from the private sector, from civil society, to look at different national contexts or sometimes even regional contexts in small group setups. And this is exciting. The initiative from IIPP, co-led by Co-Develop, is at the website dpigovernance.org. And I'm sure, Gavin, if you have more resources, you should plug them in here. But since there's increasing interest in how to problem solve very contextually for these issues, it's very useful to have these repos out there. So at least it's a starting point.
Absolutely. Gavin, before we go into the Q&A, I wanted to, I know Kristina's looking for and collecting research questions. And Krisstina, I've got this hunch that over the COVID period, especially in our developing countries, that we have done some pretty incredible things, navigating some of the constraints that we face, whether it's, we zero rated specific content, and albeit under emergency conditions. But also that kind of multi-stakeholder cohesion that we speak about, tended to just happen quite naturally. And so if you're collecting research questions, I wonder if there are some really, really good lessons and cases coming out of the African countries in terms of how we navigated some of the COVID complexities, leveraging data and limitations on infrastructure, and navigating some of our structural challenges. To also just get that broad sensitization and get everybody working together quite quickly. And I think there might be some interesting lessons there. And Gavin, equally keen, as Krisstina says, to hear what others are thinking and if they've got questions.
Great. I promised at the beginning that I would, in a room of specialists, I will try and sound bright and ask at least 2 questions. I have 2 for you. Laugh them off or answer them. And then there is one in the audience. So let me give you my 2 in the audience's question so far, and then have you discuss that as the 3rd segment. I'll then also keep an eye on for any others. So stealing from this afternoon's panel, which is really going to challenge the P in DPI, right, as to what it really stands for and what it stands for in the African context. One of the issues that we came across in this recent 14-country DPI scan was this issue of trust. The citizens' trust in government, the private sector's trust in government's capabilities to deliver things like DPI, and the citizens' trust in government over the citizens' trust in the private sector. And so my question for you there is, do we really think in the African context that governance done well in DPI will engender consumer trust? Question 1. The second is, everything that you have spoken about today really comes down to country level citizen, country level whole of society, etc. One of the things that I found interesting in that research work that we did was WAIMU as a region. And I'm wondering, can governance be done regionally, right? Or is this only at a sovereign level? Okay, so that's my attempt at 2 bright questions. Let's check in with Sohaib in our audience. He's asking, since DPI can present itself as an opportunity for multi-stakeholder participation, is it fair to assume a possible opportunity for multi-stakeholder governance? If so, can you elaborate how? So I'll post my 2 in the block there, and let's use that as your 7 minutes. Let's take 5 minutes to try and answer those.
I'm happy to kick off, and Gavin, those are fantastic questions. I think that the first one around trust is that I suppose the thesis with DPI is that you enable transparency, and when you enable transparency, by extension, you're going to get trust because you get a better view of what's going on and how your actions are being interpreted. Having said that, I've become a little skeptical of current practices and where we might need to be. So where we are versus where we might need to be, especially because we are bombarded by emerging tech and it's no longer emerging. And because of the volume that we're dealing with, there's this scaling up and the kind of unknowns. And so for me as a lawyer, I'm the the person who puts the dampener on the very exciting initiative, because I'm the person who's saying, well, let's check this, let's check the regulation, let's see if we can do this and what the parameters might be and what the conditional sort of environment might be. And at the same time, I think there's an opportunity in that, because if you are able to give assurances along the way in whatever processes you're undertaking, whether it is that this particular infrastructure is safe, whether we can demonstrate that we can deal with your data very safely, and that we've got the necessary security in place, that's how you start to build trust. And what I would urge governments who are engaging in this big DPI exercise to consider is whether along the way, whether they're telling the story of what they're putting in place to build trust, whether it's something that's behind the scenes or whether they are conveying that, and whether they, as part of their communications work, it's not just about bringing the citizen in and growing their participation, but it's growing their understanding and belief that this is being done in a trustworthy way. And then you've got something powerful. And who are your allies in building trust? It could be regulators that establish a standard and say, this is what we're looking for. This is when we feel you're doing it the right way. For a public sector that wants to share the personal data, this is how we would advise you to do it. This is the code. And then when you do that in the way that the regulators advised, you're also building trust. And so as you go along, please keep sharing with others what it is that you're doing and how you're doing it to build that trust. Regionally, I think that's something for all of us, potentially others that are on the call as well, to just joining the summit, to just put our heads together on. Because if we've got a regional model that similarly, gives a framework that can be leveraged. We've seen it in the EU, we've seen it in other areas where you've seen something that's a Kickstarter. If this is your starter block and you're facing these questions, here are some options. And how you can navigate that. And that's definitely something that we have to do. We've got really exciting initiatives to leverage, like Smart Africa, like the digital transformation strategy that the African Union has set. And so in there, we've got the kinds of principles we need that set the ambition for innovation in this space. We need to leverage that and move that dial forward. And then just on the multi-stakeholder, but I just want to say that it's this, I am overexposed, let's say, to the developing economy context and the need for partnerships, and in the most unexpected times and with the most unexpected actors, but building a framework to bring in the right people at the right time to help navigate, draw from lessons, draw from existing infrastructure is really going to be key. That's how we're going to be resourceful. That's how we're going to be responsible. And it's also how we're going to be accountable, because we have to return to the table, with the multi-stakeholders and explain our actions. And that's what we want to do.
I agree.
Krisstina?
I agree completely. Priya said everything, but I'm going to use the last 2 minutes wisely. Two things that stood out for me and for the map. One is something a colleague likes to say, who's Matthew from CoDevelop, which is that DPI moves at the speed of trust, which tells us that trust is not an absolute, it's not a binary, it doesn't exist or doesn't exist or not exist. It has to be continuously built through policy, through process, through engagement, so on and so forth. Something that stood out for us in developing the DPI governance work module, with the website of which Caitlin has just shared on the chat, is that countries and contexts can take two different ways to solve for trust and to speak to the governance context, which is either you solve for specific risks or you build trust as a value and a principle of your institutions, which is that if your institutions are trusted more generally and they engage in trust positive behaviors, practices, implementations, projects, then the trust in the product of that institution is going to be high. So if an ID project is coming out of a ministry that's well regarded by a leader that's well regarded, that's constantly engaging with citizens and individuals in the country, then there's going to be more engagement, which could be constructive and negative to begin with, but eventually it builds trust in the long term. And something that stood out to your question about regional projects, Gavin, I think that's very true. And we saw that in the African context. Africa Nenda has done brilliant work on mapping not only in the payments context, what are national payment systems that African countries are building and rolling out, but also what are regional initiatives in payment systems. And what is interesting is that sometimes they're replacing the need for a national payment system because it does involve infrastructure investment. And so governance then becomes a question not only of the national context, but also the regional body. Sometimes it's a trade association, sometimes it's a bank association. It depends on what the body is. And if it's a body that's an implementation and an executive body, then how are they reined in? So who are they regulated by? Does that body have trust? Does that body exist nationally or regionally? And ultimately, what does the chain of liability look like? And I think Priya will one up that as a lawyer. So I think regional governance is definitely forming, and it's promising for contexts that have research constraints sometimes, but it's about solving for what is the institutional setup and what does liability look like in case something gets wrong, because it can't be free reign. And I'll end with that.
And what a fantastic ending. And they're also going to cut our live feed. So I just want to thank you both and thank the audience as well. And looking forward to see you in this afternoon sessions. That was fantastic. Thank you.